I'm Colin Robinson from Trinidad and Tobago, where, in distinction to other places in the Caribbean, our agenda, our policy agenda, among LGBT leaders and organizers, has focused on the question of social inclusion as opposed to litigating decriminalization of sexual behavior. And in the midst of our last election, we came up with a 6-point policy platform, six things our government could do within its first, or new government could do within its first 6 months in office. And many of the issues there focused on questions of addressing forms of social exclusion. Two particular planks were homelessness and school safety. In terms of homelessness, we've seen a pattern of young people who often, because of their gender expression or their sexual orientation, sexual identity, have been pushed out of their families, have not completed school, and have ended up marginally housed, many of them turning to sex work. And then often, when they end up on the street, have the 1920s loitering law used to criminalize them. So there's this ongoing pattern in which they are responded to by various institutional structures in ways that just compound their social exclusion. And we're looking at ways that we can begin to address those intersecting issues. Many of the young people are of transgender experience or gender transgressive in some way, and so that becomes a core way to begin to do sensitization and education of institutional structures around questions of stigma and exclusion. Another big piece for us was how in schools specifically we can create spaces that teach young people different ways to engage with diversity and difference, and create and to undo some kinds of toxic or harmful masculinities that shape, in many cases, people's futures. And we focused on how we've linked to a discourse in the Caribbean about how harmful masculinities are tied to questions of homophobia, and how in many instances homophobia is shutting down for men and boys opportunities that feminism has been opening up for women and girls, and the ways in which homophobia hurts not just LGBT people, but also straight men and boys particularly, and the ways in which we can use schools as sites to create future cultures, but also the ways in which it's important to create safe spaces in schools where people can develop a healthy sense of their own adult identity, and are allowed to take advantage of education in ways in which we know bullying tends to shut down and tends to deprive people even of their lives. Yeah. Sadly, the Caribbean in the 21st century, in many ways, it looks a lot like it did in the 16th century. We're labeled as a place that is superlatively homophobic, when the lived reality is much more complex. And it's also become a place where many global north and external interests have seen fertile soil for fundraising and for expansion. And so we're struggling in the small territories that we have in the region to create the infrastructure to support domestic political advocacy and make change, whereas there are a number of international actors who are seeing the region as a new place for them to make change. And there's this creeping internationalism that in many instances has taken on a crusading form and is not, has proven to have very limited accountability to domestic agendas, a real difficulty in listening. We've seen millions of dollars being poured into groups that are not indigenous, that in many instances are well-meaning, but whose accountability and whose agenda is not being driven by domestic political realities, and who've proven through a number of recent missteps and frankly arrogance to be at risk of doing political damage at the local level in the region, despite their good intentions. And one of our goals is to transform how those groups work in the region so that they're really accountable and that their resources are being used much more effectively and efficiently by making sure that a domestic agenda that follows a political vision is leading where those resources are being applied. One of the things I've taken to saying over the last few weeks is that how we engage with homophobia in the Caribbean needs to mirror the work that we did around apartheid, and that we didn't end apartheid without following the leadership of the ANC. Similarly, while many of the actors in the North may be well-meaning, the drive to lead needs to be checked. And if people really want to help us get where we're going, very often that means leaving us in the driver's seat and getting behind the car and pushing. Well, the agenda is not, there isn't one size or one strategy that fits all. The most important thing is to build the capacity of domestic movements to be credible, to be accountable, and to be effective. That's how political and policy change largely got made in countries in the North. It's also about how we build alliances. We are a minority community. We need to build cultures in our societies of minority rights, and we need to build alliances with other stakeholders with whom we share interests in advancing certain principles around sexual rights, around minority rights, around concepts of citizenship and equality and justice for all. That's, in my view, the kinds of measures that will lead to change. It's about LGBT people taking leadership, but also how we begin to work on broader causes that begin to advance our particular agendas, and how we engage in direct political engagements with people who have the capacity to make change. We have the ability to do that in most Caribbean, if not all Caribbean nations, unlike perhaps many nations, for example, in the Middle East. We have the opportunity to show up. There are threats of violence, yes, but with the right kind of bravery, with the right kind of strategic thinking, change is very imminent. All of us.